Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Debating for America's Youth. Today, I'm interviewing an awesome guest. Today, I'm interviewing Manu Onteeru, who is the 2020 NSDA National Champion in Senate Congressional Debate, as well as the final round presiding officer and the Senate Leadership Bowl winner for the final round. Welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. So first of all, I think it's really crazy and awesome how you're able to be presiding officer and win the final session. Kind of, how did you stand out to the judges as a presiding officer, and even though you weren't giving speeches?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I was lucky enough to PO at the TOC as well, so I was a little bit better versed than a lot of people in online presiding. So by the time I had gotten to the final round of NSGA, I had already gone through almost 5 different rounds of POing. So I picked up on a lot of different things. First, it's really easy to lose the PO when you're in an online format because it's not like they're in the front of the room for everyone to see. So during chamber deliberations, I tried to definitely lead everyone and steer them in a better direction. Second, if there was something like a one-sided debate, I always tried to interject and get the chamber to write more speeches. Rather than just being a conventional presiding officer, I tried to make myself as like a chamber leader, and I think that really paid off. And that's all in conjunction with like a lot of little things that you can do to make the room move a little faster, like color-coded time cards or using the spreadsheet for precedence and recency, etc.
Yeah, that completely makes sense. And I'll say for me, when I went to the NSDA Senior Open tournament, I was I was presiding officer as well, and not for the final round, but I was presiding officer. And the color-coded time cards I saw, I picked up on that and used it when I was presiding officer because it's such a better way on this virtual format for people to actually see the time without interrupting them by cutting them off. Because a lot of times, how the way that like the mics work, it cuts their audio off. So I think that that's a very good way to kind of, I guess, stand out.
Exactly. It makes it a lot easier. And a lot of people didn't really pick up on that. So I'm glad that hopefully at least in online tournament for the next year, POs can start working off a lot of our trial runs to make rounds even more efficient.
Yeah, that completely makes sense. And then, so we were talking a little bit about, like a little bit before this interview about how you're able to actually like run the chamber. Can you walk us through your process of like how you're able to like, I guess, organize the chamber and keep track of precedence and recency?
Yeah, of course. So in the online format, I realized that precedence and recency would probably be hard to do on my laptop because I'd have to like cut the Zoom screen in half. So I kept everything down on paper. And I actually found that pretty easy because at NSGA specifically, there was preset recency. So it's not like I had any choice in picking what the speakers were. It was just going down a list. So I had like a 0 at the top for questioners and a 0 at the top for speeches, wrote down that preset questioning and recency, the preset recency for questioning and speeches. And then as people kept raising their placards throughout the round, I moved them down the list. So that's a pretty conventional method to do it. A lot of tournaments do a lot of different things. So at NSGA specifically, we weren't allowed to share that preset recency with the student speakers. So I didn't have a spreadsheet that I could send them. But for example, at the TOC, we were allowed to do that. So all of my precedence and recency, in addition to being on paper, was also on a Google Sheet that everyone in the chamber, all the judges had access to.
That's interesting. I feel like, yeah, the same way worked with the NSDA Senior Open. And I was a little bit unsure, like, I don't know, do you know the reason why, like, I guess for NSDA, it wasn't shared with everyone beforehand? Was it just to make sure that the presiding officer wasn't having to, like, I guess, battle all their competitors? Or do you know the reason behind that?
Yeah, so what I've heard is that what the NSDA is thinking was that if a student knows when they're going to speak in a round or what their recency is, it's not like they're going to stand up to speak when they actually want to speak. Because say you have like the last recency, but you really want to give the authorship, if you know that you have the last recency, you're not going to stand for that authorship. So by making it completely blinded to everyone except for the parliamentarian and the presiding officer, students were more likely to stand up when they legitimately wanted to give their arguments.
That makes a lot of sense, actually. And then it kind of creates a more realistic, like, session of Congress.
Exactly.
Another question is, so when you're running for PO, I'm not sure exactly how it worked at the NSDA National Final Round, but for most tournaments, when you run for PO, what's your pitch? How do you stand out to the room full of competitors and get elected PO in the first place?
Yeah, so that's also a really good question. Funnily enough, I only PO'd on the national circuit one time before POing online. So I didn't really have to worry too much about my pitches there. But online, what I tried to do was showcase my skill and experience in Congress, and B, prove myself as different from all the other POs. So on the former, it was mostly just talking about how I've done Congress for years now, and I understand not only parliamentary procedure, but also fairness in speeches, questioning, etc. So I kind of proved myself as a leader who would be capable to be PO. But then on the latter, I talked about things like that spreadsheet, color-coded time cards, just little things that I picked up over my time online presiding that other students might realize would be really helpful to them while they're speaking. And as a result of that, I think that a lot of them voted for me.
Yeah, but it makes sense what you were saying, to talk about how like you want to show that you can stand out in the round and like put yourself apart from everyone else. So if you don't mind, if we move into more of the traditional style of not POing, but just like traditional like debate,
Yeah.
what research process look like when you first get a bill? How do you research? And especially for bigger tournaments like NSDA Nationals, where you have a huge docket, how do you balance prepping all of the different bills?
So that's actually a really good question, and something that I struggled with a lot in my time competing. So back in my freshman and sophomore year, I did a lot of legwork. So it was researching every bill, doing a lot of in-depth work. That way, throughout my junior and senior year, I had a lot of back prep and back files that I could just pull up before tournaments, and I could use those directly. In terms of my actual research process, what I normally do is I read the bill and I see if there are any sections that stand out to me, like if they talk about an organization in charge of implementation or a specific policy proposal, all of that, I take notes on that. Then after that, I typically think, are there any intuitive arguments that I have that I can further research? And I note those down. So once I have those interesting components of the bill as well as intuitive arguments, then I begin with like general reading. So typically high level sources like Brookings, the Council on Foreign Relations, the CSIS, etc. And once I have kind of that very broad-based fundamental knowledge, then I start looking into like more specific arguments and more specific studies that I can use to cite.
That makes a lot of sense, and having those strong sources can a lot of times help you in the round and stand out if you're able to have these strong sources, especially when you're like, I guess, clashing with other evidence in the round.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of question, what does your questioning process look like? Do you like come up with questions based on the bill, or do you like come up with them based on like the speeches in the round?
So it's largely based on the speeches in the round. What I've realized throughout competing is that people who pre-write questions tend to be like very rote in the questioning process, which means that if the other person is defending or trying to take you off track, you stay on that track. And I'll admit, like I made a bunch of those mistakes before I realized that actually trying to engage with the speaker resonated very well with both me and the judges. So typically what I do in questioning periods is I flow down the entire round. I'm giving a crystallization, or if I'm just bored. So I know how all the arguments engage with each other. And then during questioning, if I notice any significant like logical fallacies, or if I just don't really understand a point or don't think it's true, then I try and ask smaller questions in order to lead up to one big question that will hopefully knock that argument out entirely.
What about for like indirect questioning, where you're only allowed to ask like one question? How do you like work that logic train when it's only one question?
Yeah, so also a good question. I think that indirect questioning often stumps a lot of people because they just think, okay, since I can only ask, like, since it's only like a one-way street in terms of engagement, I'll just ask as many questions as I can throughout the round. And I think that worked for some judges, but from what I've realized, it's not a matter of quantity, it's quality. So say you only ask 2 questions that are really, really good, that's better than asking 10 that are tangentially related or don't really move the debate forward. So my process in coming up with questions for indirect are typically just longer questions that cover what I would cover an entire direct questioning block. So like, if this is true, then how is this true? Or something along the lines of that, where I establish the premise early on before I move into the question. But during direct questioning, I have time to actually hear if they agree with that premise. In indirect, they can avoid your question really easily because you don't get a chance to reply. So you shouldn't be too worried about it.
Totally. And then what does your practice look like for like before you go into a Congress session? Do you have like a mock Congress session with other people? Do you practice out your speeches beforehand? Do you like go over like presiding officer procedure for those that you're going to be a PO at? Like what's your practice before a tournament?
So first, in terms of speaking, I have the tendency to go overtime. So like whenever I have my first draft of a speech done, is almost always at like 4.5 minutes. So at that point, it's just like really tuning down exactly what I'm saying, not necessarily memorizing, but just like eliminating sources or specific statistics to really crank it down into the time limit. Because my problem isn't necessarily fluency, it's that I have so much to say that I like jumble over my words at the end of my speeches if I don't trim them down. So my practice is mostly alone, just timing and recording myself. Initially, when I was starting off on the national circuit, a lot of my practice was just videotaping myself so I could see what my gestures were like, how my intonation was, if my movements were natural. And then eventually, once I got those things kind of grounded down so I knew what I needed to do, I stopped doing that. But recording yourself is very highly recommended. In terms of presiding, I almost always have a game plan going into the tournament as to whether or not I'm presiding. So like, for example, at NSDA this year, I knew that A, it was a brand new format, and B, NSDA tends to reward presiding officers. So I figured that if I could correctly execute POing all 3 rounds in Senate, then there's a chance that I could perform very, very well. So I decided that ahead of time, like a week before the tournament. And of course I had like prep in case I didn't win the election. But at that point, it was mostly just like reviewing the amendment procedure, making sure that I knew off the back of my hands the 1/3, 2/3, and majority splits for chambers of all sizes, just to kind of increase my speed for when I was actually POing.
So can you kind of like explain more into depth to those who don't know, what do you mean by NSDA rewards presiding officers? Do they encourage judges to rank them higher, or what does that look like?
So a lot of different tournaments treat presiding officers differently. So for example, I know at tournaments such as Princeton, presiding officers rarely break into the final round out of semifinals because the judge pool just tends to rank speakers higher. At tournaments like NCFL, for example, it's a similar thing where if you PO in finals, it's very difficult to come in the top 3. At NSDA and Harvard, however, it's just been historically proven that if you are a good presiding officer, if you get all the speakers in, if you don't make any major flaws, you'll very likely be ranked well. The way that you kind of get to know which tournaments are good to PO at and which tournaments are bad to PO at are just by like actually competing in them and just asking around for word of mouth. But generally, like at least at NSDA and Harvard historically, if you're an effective PO, you almost always rank in the top 3.
Okay, so those tournaments where it's harder to, I guess, get higher ranked as a PO, like, I guess, like, do you do anything different to, like, if you were a PO at these tournaments? Like, I was at NCFLs, and in, I mean, maybe this doesn't apply because it was a prelim round, but I was the presiding officer, and I didn't break out, right? I don't think I was the best PO, but it was harder for me, I think, to break out of the prelim round. Like, do you have any recommendations for those who are trying to, because someone has to be PO at these tournaments, right? Do you have any recommendations to stand out or, like, to be able to break or place high at these tournaments where their presiding officer is not necessarily rewarded?
Yeah, so another good question. I think there's kind of 2 facets to that. So first, whenever I was thinking about POing, I always thought, would I do better if I was a PO or if I was a speaker? That's a pretty basic question that everyone should ask themselves. And depending on that and depending on the tournament, I decided what I wanted to do. Over my past, like since from freshman through junior year, I think I PO'd 1 time on the national circuit because I kind of wanted to prove myself as a speaker, because honestly, Congress is a little bit difficult to do if you're coming from a smaller school and you don't have a lot of relations with coaches, if you don't know judges, if you haven't been to camps, all of that. So I just try to make myself better known on the Congress circuit as uniquely a speaker, so not as a PO. And then by the time I got into my senior year, after speaking through all of the in-person tournaments, I decided that I should PO at TOC and NSDA. That's not saying that you shouldn't PO at tournaments where POing isn't favored. Like, you need a PO in every single round. And for that reason, say there is no PO, you can probably be rewarded by the judges if you volunteer. Because remember, if you're judging Congress, you recognize that being PO is a sacrifice. The way to effectively do that, in my opinion, is by kind of inserting yourself into the chamber. A lot of the times POs think that they shouldn't be noticed at all, that they should just kind of stay in the background and recognize speakers. But the most effective POs kind of encourage the flow of debate by getting speakers on both sides, by encouraging questioners during recesses, by reminding the chamber that you should have a balanced debate or when you should be back for debate. By kind of inserting yourself in those scenarios, you're showing the judges that you're not just a good presiding officer, you're also a leader in the round, and that helps you rank higher.
Yeah, and then in terms of ranking high in terms of like Senate Leadership Bowl winner, like
Mhm.
winning, obviously you talked about like inserting yourself in these different situations. How do you think, like, what do you think helped you win that Senate Leadership Bowl, like, I guess, award?
Yeah, so quite honestly, I'm not sure. Like, I think a lot of the people in the round just knew who I was from competing with me in like other final rounds and other tournaments in the past, so that couldn't have hurt. But I think that a lot of the times people say that leadership bowls are who the students think should win the tournament. So like sometimes leadership bowls and like the actual first place rankings are different because again, like competitors have different perceptions from the judges. So again, I'm not really sure why I ranked so high. Hopefully I was like a very fair and kind PO. But yeah, like if you want to win a leadership bowl, just be a nice person. That's something very important that people in Congress don't realize.
That completely makes sense. And then, so the final question of this interview is: so everyone who's watching right now, wants to hear what you have to say. Do you have like a message for the speech and debate community and all those who are watching this interview right now? I'll say that some people took this question to kind of talk about some things they wish they could see like the community improve on, and some people just took this opportunity just to thank the community or thank people within the community. So, however you want to take this question, your message, your time for the speech and debate community.
So I think I've said a lot of my thank yous already, so I don't necessarily want to focus on that. But to anyone who's listening who has done Congress and thinks they're really bad at it, I promise you that if you keep working, it will get better. And that sounds so incredibly cliche, but like back in my freshman year, like I was breaking at tournaments, but a lot of the times I didn't think I deserved to or that it was just a fluke. But as I kept competing and as I kept getting better and better and better, it really encouraged me. At the same time, I have a lot of privilege in debate, being a man, which I'm very, very grateful for. But I know that a lot of women and other people of color are discriminated against, which is completely unjustified. So to anyone who's ever presiding out there, or really anyone who's competing, this is again said a lot, but I don't think people realize it. Treating others with equity and kindness and fairness and respecting everyone's voice, regardless of their background, is absolutely necessary in an event, especially Congress, because Congress is meant to be representative of the United States. People think that like, oh, I'm just doing this activity to get in college. You have a legitimate platform where you can share ideas that empower people who actually need it. So the more authentic you are and the more legitimate you are and the more fair and kind you are to people of all backgrounds, the better you'll do in round.
I completely agree. I think that, yeah, Congress as an activity needs to become, I guess, as fair and equitable as possible. And I think that, like, yeah, especially when, like cutting people off for speeches or being a PO, you have the ability to, I guess, be really like damaging to people who are not part of your like group or anything like that. I think that being more accepting as a community, especially a Congress community, can, I guess, make the activity a much better place that other people can join, and despite their economic or privileged background.
Exactly. It's just really important. It doesn't matter what your gender identity is or your sexuality or your income status or your race, like you have a voice in this event. And again, people always don't listen to like the equity officer or whatever the NSDA has to say. As a, I guess, former competitor now, I'm telling you, if you empower others and encourage them to share their stories, not only will you become a more informed person, but you will become a lot better at Congress because you're more receptive to different ideas, which is so important.
I completely agree. And I wanted to thank you so much for coming on and kind of sharing your voice to the speech and debate community. So thank you so much again.
No worries. Thank you so much. I hope you have a great rest of your day.